if we focus on everything that is unraveling, then we will not have the stamina to get through. So we have to take a decision. Which side of the fence are we going to fall off on? The action side or the paralysis side? These times call on us to be the best people that we can be.
Welcome to the Inner Green Deal podcast, where we talk to inspiring guests about the human dimension of sustainability and explore the link between our personal journeys and the positive impacts we can have on the world. My name is Tamsin Walker. In this month's episode, we'll be looking at the patterns of human behaviour that are driving the climate crisis and exploring how our unchecked use of resources means we're taking ever more in the course of a given year than the planet can regenerate. To get into this, I'm talking to Phoebe Barnard. Phoebe wears many hats. She is a biodiversity and climate scientist, systems and policy strategist, societal futurist, writer and film producer, as well as a mentor for young, often female, professionals in STEM around the world. She's also campaign advisor at the Global Evergreening Alliance, convener of the Global Restoration Collaborative, affiliate professor at the University of Washington, and researcher at the University of Cape Town. Knowing that human behaviour, numbers and consumption underlie some of the biggest challenges of our time, she recently co-authored a study on the behavioural crisis driving ecological overshoot. Welcome, Phoebe.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. It is really a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, we're going to be talking today about the consequences of human behavior on the health of the planet. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you to take us on a journey to a place that was important for you growing up, and this could be a place in nature, perhaps.
Being out in nature was really the seat of my own privilege. I was not born to a very wealthy family at all, but my parents both loved nature. When I was a child in New England, in the USA, we were surrounded by woods and hills and farms. And so I would disappear for hours at a time. I would go out and play in the woods on my own, building little houses, climbing trees, for most of the afternoon when I didn't have to be in school. And so that gave me a sense of inner independence and inner peace that I think has been with me to this day and that I can draw upon even in the worst of times.
I've also read that you like running in the woods and you like to climb mountains and volcanoes. So a lot of nature going on in your free time as well, by the sounds of it. Do you think, kind of, if you look back, would you say that it was always going to be that way for you? It was always going to be working with nature in some capacity?
Never a question about that. I did geology and biology and education and psychology, and all of those are coming into play now for my life as a global change scientist, really trying to shift human behavior and human perception in order to steer this Titanic away from the iceberg.
Okay. Well, you were involved recently in a paper looking at the drivers behind ecological overshoot. And I do want to get into the findings of that paper. But before we go there, can you explain exactly what is overshoot?
Ecological overshoot is simply the state of consuming and being more than the planet can handle. For most of human civilization, as I think we all know, we lived in small numbers. We lived as hunter-gatherers. Only in the last 10,000 years or so have we developed even agriculture, which radically changed the way we concentrated ourselves in space and time on the planet. And it always seemed to me that the resources that we were trying to use were constantly under threat, and that climate change or biodiversity loss or social tension, unemployment, whatever it might be, that these were all just symptoms of overshoot, and that we would not be able to make lasting progress on any of these symptoms if we didn't call out the root cause. The root cause is ultimately our evolutionary behaviors and how maladapted to our current situation of 8 billion people all competing for space and profit and dominance and status on a very finite, very fragile, exquisitely evolved, beautiful planet.
So just picking up from that on the subject of overshoot, I suppose we should also mention different countries overshoot at different times. And if I'm not mistaken, most European countries overshoot within the first 5 months of the year, whereas you've got other countries, less industrialized countries, that actually don't overshoot until December or later in the year. Then there's also Earth Overshoot Day, which is just getting earlier and earlier in the year as we move through time.
Yeah, absolutely. And just by way of comparison, in 2023, many countries that in Europe and North America may be seen as developing countries are also overshooting really early on. Belize on the 15th of March, Bhutan the 22nd of April, but Benin on the 26th of December. And so that dramatically changes how we think about development. It really says to me that we are so vastly overshot in most of the world. And so we need to really think carefully about what 8 billion people living sustainably looks like.
So that also, I mean, that takes me directly to the paper in which you identified what you call the human behavior crisis as the driver for ecological overshoot. So can you give a bit of an insight into the facets of that crisis, the human behavior crisis?
It's interesting that starting out my life as an evolutionary and behavioral ecologist, I didn't face this full on earlier in my career than I did. I think I saw it as something that was driving a lot of behaviors that were problematic. But at that time, and still to this day, people were trying to treat the symptoms rather than the root causes. And so it took me quite a long time to realize that it's more than just talking about our numbers, in other words, our human population, or our appetites, our hyperconsumption in much of the world, or even our production or waste management, any of that, that it's more the behaviors that drive our relationship to the planet. So when Joseph Mertz and all of our colleagues and I started working on this paper, I had to go on a little bit of a journey myself in terms of remembering how our minds had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of hominin evolution, and what it is that has stood us through the test of time as people living in small bands of hunter-gatherers, having to be able to distinguish friend from foe, mate from food at the same time, especially if you think about where humanity was 10, 12,000 years ago as we went into this very even and predictable climate space, the Holocene era. We need to remember that conditions could be unpredictable and we could often go hungry. And so being able to lay in food and acquire resources that could keep us alive through the winter, that was all super important. So fast forward to 2024. How do those behaviors play out in the world today? Well, they have been playing out in sometimes really wonderful ways of reciprocal altruism, but increasingly the economic systems that we have been developing and using strike to the heart of our tendency to compete. And we've learned to compete for dominance. We've learned to compete for status. And of course, I don't want to simplify this, We are an incredibly complex, intellectual, messy species for which, I don't want to give platitudes about our evolutionary history, but they do provide us with some clear clues, I guess, to what is happening with our behaviors as they play out today, which have been exploited by corporate interests and the marketing companies that represent them to make us buy things that we don't want or we don't need, but we think we must have, or else we will not be dominant. We will not be sexy. We will not have status. People won't want to be like us. And so it's become this almost absurd corruption of our evolutionary history for private profit.
Well, okay. So, I mean, you mentioned the marketing there, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the paper, which is, I mean, the whole thing was interesting. But one thing that really stood out to me was the suggestion of using marketing, media, and the entertainment industries essentially to undo the impacts of our efforts to undermine planetary health thus far. So, to use them to educate and make acceptable or even desirable to live differently with less, to all intents and purposes, and less carbon intensive ways, to have fewer children and so on. When I read that, I thought, okay, it's kind of revolutionary, the idea of flipping what these industries have done in recent decades and creating a whole new way of existing through them or with their help. My question there is, how likely are these industries, how likely is it that they will want to or will get on board with such an idea?
I think it'll be a challenge. And if only we had 1,000 years to play with, I would be pretty confident about it. One thing that I really enjoyed about the paper was the unreal experience, almost a surreal experience, but an exciting one, of working with some of the key influential people in the marketing industry who were very aware of the damage and the culpability, I guess, that their industry had for driving humanity to the brink of the abyss, and really wanted to work to help change that, at the very least to explore how it might be done. Rory Sutherland, for example, the vice chair of Ogilvy, is one of the most influential marketing strategists on the planet. So for him to be part of the paper was a really significant thing. And it may be called into question, quite rightly, how can we expect companies that have preyed upon our worst and weakest human natures for profit to suddenly turn to drive humanity back to a state of sustainability? And I think the only response I can give to that is we have no choice but to do it. We have a matter of years left to make dramatic changes on at least 6 dimensions of our human condition, from the very systemic, like the economy and our governance and political electoral systems, all the way down to our psyche and our spiritual natures. The hill is incredibly steep. And if we can't manage change on at least several of those levels, which I think will be enough to tip the rest into play, then we are really committing ourselves to quite a significantly miserable future, not only for our grandchildren and our children, but, to be honest, now ourselves. So we need to think seriously out of the box about how to make these changes rapidly and how to do it in the fairest, most justice-based way possible. Because I don't think any of us should want to go to a point of autocracy. I think all of us know that the democracy that we mostly know and love is a very important but slow process. I've felt for a long time that it's not up to the tasks ahead with rapid social and financial, economic, political, ecological change. And so I feel we have no choice but to think about every possible tool in our toolbox to be able to turn this Titanic around in time.
Is that where the proposal in the paper that the human behavioral crisis be globally recognized as a critical intervention point for tackling ecological overshoot? Is that where that recommendation comes in? And if so, what would that global recognition actually entail? How would that play out?
Well, I think in all kinds of ways, starting at the local scale on up to the global scale. It's first of all a matter of starting the conversation in families, in faith communities, in towns and cities, when we talk about the nature of the changes that we need to make. Not calling it out means that we condemn ourselves to fighting within that assumption that we can't change it because we are humans and that's just our nature. The longer that we keep saying that, the less likely we are to be able to even steer the main bow of the Titanic away from the iceberg. But if we can talk about it at societal levels, that's a really important way to start being able to remind people the world doesn't have to be this way. Our mindsets don't have to be this way. Our public policy needs to be centered in the mindsets that we need to aspire to and be supported in going forward. And there are plenty of examples in this. I mean, the very nature of public policy is usually to shift human behavior. But we've been assuming that just by providing fiscal incentives or tax breaks or, that kind of thing, that we will be able to shift human behavior. Trying to spell out different levels and goals for getting the conversation underway and into public policy, and what we call the enabling framework for society, the laws and the policies and the constitutions. That's all necessary, and we have no time to waste. We've really got to start doing it.
Okay. There is a good deal of polarization, isn't there, around things like consumer behavior and so on. And I come up against this question often: how do you convince people, particularly if they're not really interested in the state of the planet, how do you get through to them? It seems so incredibly difficult.
It is difficult, and that's why we've failed. Our purpose should not be to try and convince people. The point is to make them aware of what our inadvertent, instinctive, or learned cultural behaviors are doing that's making us unhealthy and unhappy. And at some personal level, most people can relate to that, even if they don't give a stuff about the planet. But the whole point of marketing is to be just more embedded, essentially, without having to have this kind of tiresome conversation about what people should be doing. Rather just make it sexy, make it attractive, make it a matter of dominance and status, to be behaving differently, to be doing something for your community that people admire. When I was living in South Africa, I was working for a government-funded agency on biodiversity and climate change. But I remember one of my colleagues, who was a director general, saying he was trying to facilitate the rollout of solar panels in South Africa so that people wouldn't have to pay for their electricity, to have hot water for the first time ever, to be able to take a hot shower. And he said people reject solar panels on their homes in the townships a lot of the time because they see it as a badge of poverty, not as a doorway to the future. So we have to get outside our own mindsets about what people see and be listening and hearing people and talking to people about how they perceive things. So for me, it just seemed like an obvious thing to do, to just facilitate the rollout of solar panels on rich people's roofs And then that might change things. But until we understand the kind of dominance and the deep perverse system inequalities that currently exist, if we don't put those inequalities at the center of our solutions, then it will be multiplied a thousandfold.
I mean, that's a very interesting example that you gave. Presumably, that's also where marketing comes back into play, then, or potentially at least.
Marketing can do quite a lot, but it has to be very well crafted. And so Joseph Mertz, in his institute, has started up this group. They call it the Overshoot Behaviour Lab to work out what might work. The marketing industry does this all the time. Who are our audiences? What are the messages? How can they play out? And so it's easy for them to just switch it in the other direction and say, if we want to achieve this, who are our audiences? What are the messages? How might they play out? The key thing is to understand really the boomerang effects that sometimes happen with what people of privilege might think about the way that people will receive incentives and suggestions and marketing versus how they really do.
You mentioned before social tipping points. That's also something that we're hearing more frequently, I feel. I don't know how close we are to reaching any social tipping point at all, but maybe you have some insight into that.
I think we know a few things from studies that show you don't actually need a big proportion of the society to shift their behavior for it to start a cascading effect that brings a tipping point. At the moment, this is one of the bleakest geopolitical moments that I can think of. It's not an easy time to do any of this right now. So how does one achieve tipping points? Well, the first step is never to assume that there's a foregone conclusion. The future is not written. There are a lot of people with a lot of concern about the world as it is, and history moves in pendulum swings. So whenever people take things too far, there's a backlash against that. And I think we need to first have the confidence that we can triumph if we are clever and that we are using multiple tactics to help shift people away from danger, which is why we have to go forward extremely confidently and use multiple tactics to help pull humanity back from the edge. One of the things that I am busy working on is the big initiative that I have to get 1 billion people around the world involved in the restoration economy and restoration livelihoods that build a new civilization. Now, that's almost perhaps sounding like an impossibly ambitious goal, but now is the time for big ambitious goals and really focused, really determined action. So I think we've got to assume that it can happen. We've got to be strategic about how we counter subversive, counterproductive activities that are happening in the world right now. And thirdly, just to accept that we're not going to be able to shift everybody.
Yeah, and I was actually that was something also that stood out for me was a comment about the need for cohesive societies in order for there to be action that bears fruit. And as you have just laid out there, we're not necessarily living in times of massive cohesion. Yet there are so many people around the world working for this common goal of doing good by this planet of ours. And there are alliances and there are networks and there is huge amounts of energy. At least that's how it seems to me. We don't necessarily always get to hear about that. We get to hear a lot about the kind of information that sends a shiver down your spine and makes your heart sink to your toes. But there is another side, right? I mean, there are people who are doing big, bold, brave, beautiful things in service of the planet.
There are enough of us to make a change. We need quadruple the numbers that we have, but that's where it starts. And for everything that you can say about human behavior that drives resource acquisitiveness and dominance, there is also another behavior that drives the kind of behaviors we see in a crisis. People helping out strangers, housing them in a wartime situation, being able to set up community structures, to look after nature when governments collapse. Everything like that is an equal and necessary balance right now. And we have to focus on those things. If we focus on everything that is unraveling, then we will not have the stamina to get through. So we have to take a decision. Which side of the fence are we going to fall off on? The action side or the paralysis side? These times call on us to be the best people that we can be. And if we understand that the world is not served by our anxiety, then we can find the help and support that we might need to help us through that, to bring us from anxiety into action, to bring us from cynicism into determination. Because anger is a very prominent emotion now. And yet we have to remember to turn it into action for good.
Earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned the 8 billion people and that there are too many of us. I mean, that's a big question. That's a big, big issue. Hands up, I have children. What is the answer?
First of all, I think it's never helpful for anybody to make judgments of anybody else. We have all been born and grown up and made our decisions about parenting. I myself have 2 daughters, and now I have 2 stepchildren. How can we turn ourselves into the biggest assets that we can be for this planet? And each of us has a powerful role to play. Any mother or father or grandparent or community member has a big potential effect on the mindsets and the values of those children. And that is powerful. But most of all, what I struggle, to be honest, with my children is helping them understand what we can expect in a few years' time may be very different from what we can expect now. The future is not predicted by the past. And to help them strengthen themselves for very rapidly changing times, I feel it's really, really important for people to stop bickering about family size or veganism or, I work to build restoration communities with people who are promoting sustainable rangeland management, as well as people who live in cities and are more strictly vegan than I myself am. And I have to keep saying to them both, the whole world does not have your mindset. Don't harden yourselves because there are so many of us and we all have to find the confluence of our values. We won't get that if we pick on things that we can use to divide ourselves rather than bring ourselves together.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. My last question to you is one that I ask everybody on this podcast, and that is, if you were able to decide upon a skill that everyone on the planet had, what would that skill be?
I think it would be interesting question. I love it. I think it would be the ability to reflect on what single emotion we want to bring with us into the future. Do we wish it to be hate or intolerance, or some are emotions, some are probably more physiological states of mind? Do we want to bring irritability or intolerance into the future? Or do we want to bring love for this planet, for each other, for our communities, even for the idea of civilization, because everything that we know and love is at stake right now. And we have to choose what kind of person we wish to be.
Phoebe, thank you so much for all of those insights and for taking the time to come and speak with me.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I would love to hear much more about your life too, and your perspectives on this. Maybe one of your guests should interview Tamsin himself.
Yeah, maybe one day.
I hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Phoebe. If you want to know more about her work or read the recent paper on the human behaviour driving ecological overshoot, you'll find links in the show notes. I'll be back next month with a new episode of the Inner Green Deal podcast. But you don't need to wait that long if you want to hear other interesting conversations with people working on sustainability and the establishment of deeper connections to ourselves and the world around us. You can simply scroll through the archives. And as ever, feel free to subscribe or to share. Thank you for listening. I look forward to you joining me again next time. For now though, bye-bye.